A three-day tariff pause is not the same thing as a customs rule. Reuters and NBC News describe political progress with Ottawa, but neither report turns the announcement itself into binding import instructions. Importers and logistics brokers must navigate a transition period where existing contracts and inventory valuations remain exposed to the original tariff schedule until formal regulatory updates occur. Automotive supply chains, which rely on just-in-time manufacturing across the border, face uncertainty over component costs and production schedules during this ambiguous window. The distinction between a diplomatic signal and enforceable trade policy is critical for businesses adjusting forecasts or rerouting shipments. Customs and Border Protection has not yet issued guidance on goods in transit, leaving stakeholders without clear procedural directives. That uncertainty is especially costly for goods already crossing the border, because shipment timing can change which rate customs applies. Retailers also need to know whether the pause changes landed costs already built into shelf prices, purchase orders, and customer contracts. Disputes over duty assessments remain possible once the pause expires, depending on the final terms of any agreement. Companies with long-term pricing structures can be squeezed if the pause fails to produce a comprehensive deal before the deadline. The economic effect will depend on how quickly supply chains adapt without incurring added compliance costs. A broadcast license gives the FCC leverage that an ordinary speech regulator does not have. NBC News and CNN describe the suit as a challenge to alleged retaliation through investigation and early license review. The legal challenge tests the balance between regulatory oversight and constitutional protection for broadcast entities whose operating licenses are essential for transmission. Disney and ABC argue that the timing and nature of the FCC inquiries could chill editorial independence by making programming choices carry licensing risk. An injunction would require the plaintiffs to show irreparable harm, not merely disagreement with an agency investigation. That threshold is demanding. The practical concern for journalists is that costly regulatory uncertainty can shape coverage even if the government never issues an explicit censorship order. Affiliate networks and local stations also have exposure because the contested process concerns the permissions through which programming reaches local audiences. The filing does not guarantee a favorable ruling, and courts can defer to agency expertise in technical broadcasting matters unless a constitutional violation is established. The deeper issue is whether a regulator can accelerate or reshape licensing review in a way that functions as pressure on protected speech. A ruling on immediate relief could shape how media companies respond to future agency scrutiny, long before the underlying lawsuit reaches final judgment. A headquarters move becomes harder to reverse after Congress, GSA, and contractors spend years planning it. Reuters and The Washington Post describe a judicial constraint on abandoning the Maryland plan, not final resolution of the relocation fight. The decision emphasizes compliance with procurement procedures and congressional appropriations intended to impose accountability on major federal projects. The relocation already carried sunk costs in site selection, security analysis, design, and procurement work, so reversal is not simply a change of political preference. Contractors and Maryland communities face uncertainty over work and investment tied to the selected site. Appropriations already committed by Congress also limit how freely agencies can redirect money without renewed authority. If agencies ignore the order, they risk contempt or additional litigation. If they restart work, later reversal can substantially increase taxpayer losses and contractor claims. The order blocks immediate abandonment but does not settle every dispute over cost, location, security, or operational need. Executive officials can comply, appeal, or seek a pause while the appeal proceeds, and each path creates a different timetable. Judicial review here is less about choosing an FBI address than about whether agencies followed the legal process governing the choice. New docket entries and procurement instructions will reveal whether planning resumes or remains frozen while higher courts consider the case. A glass recall is useful only if shoppers can identify the affected lots. CNN and CBS News report a possible physical contaminant in selected Outshine products, not a brand-wide finding against every fruit bar. The action is tied to specific lot codes, which lets retailers isolate named batches instead of treating every flavor and package as unsafe. Lot-level traceability narrows risk while preserving a route for refunds and product removal. A lot-specific notice also protects consumers without creating needless panic around unaffected flavors, sizes, or production dates. Retailers can pull inventory quickly, but households still need package identifiers to determine whether an item in the freezer is covered. Glass is a physical hazard because ingestion can cause cuts or internal injury. Anyone who believes an injury occurred should follow medical guidance rather than relying only on a refund. Broken glass injuries can require urgent clinical evaluation. An FDA classification would indicate how regulators assess severity, but that determination should not be assumed before publication. The manufacturing question is whether contamination was confined to one production run or exposes a broader control failure. Company instructions, retailer notices, and any regulator update should agree on product name, package size, lot code, and handling. Mismatched identifiers are a reason to verify, not to assume every Outshine product is implicated. The disputed question in Maine is not just who was targeted, but what legal authority put federal agents at the scene. AP News and the Los Angeles Times center the dispute on a fatal operation whose purpose and authorization still require independent reconstruction. The Congresswoman's assertion that the individual was not facing removal challenges a basic premise of the operation, but it does not by itself establish the complete chain of events. Removal status, warrant authority, operational purpose, and use of force justification are separate questions that can have different answers. That distinction protects accuracy. A person might be present during an operation without being the subject of a final removal order, which is why agency paperwork and the target designation matter. Body camera material, dispatch records, radio traffic, and contemporaneous reports can establish sequence more reliably than later characterizations. The chain of command is also relevant. Investigators need to know who approved the operation, what agents were told, and when the encounter changed. Local police and federal agencies may hold different portions of that record. Independent review must distinguish a planning failure from a split-second force decision instead of collapsing both into one accusation. Until those facts are reconciled, the lawmaker's claim is a serious contradiction requiring evidence, not a substitute for the inquiry itself. San Diego is using ownership of local facilities, rather than immigration law itself, as leverage. AP News and NBC News frame the county decision as withdrawal of access to locally controlled training infrastructure. That distinction matters because county officials cannot erase federal enforcement authority, but they can decide how county property, staff time, and contracts support it. Facility control is a narrow but concrete form of policy leverage. Ending range access changes logistics for firearms qualification and recurring training, forcing agencies to locate federal, private, or neighboring facilities. Contract terms will determine whether access ends immediately or only after existing reservations and agreements expire. The direct costs can include travel, scheduling delays, new fees, and reduced convenience, while the political effect is a visible reduction in local cooperation. It does not invalidate federal warrants, change immigration statutes, or prevent agents from operating in the county, nor does it necessarily end every form of coordination between local and federal personnel. The policy's real reach depends on who owns each range, which agreements govern access, and whether substitute facilities are readily available. Other counties can make different choices, so the decision does not automatically become a statewide rule. The episode shows how local governments can influence implementation through infrastructure even when the underlying enforcement power remains federal. Firing an economist can hide bad information without changing the underlying numbers. Reuters and CNBC tie the dismissal to his warning about the economic burden of a prolonged war in Ukraine. A war of attrition consumes labor, equipment, credit, and government revenue over time, so the warning concerns accumulation rather than one dramatic financial event. Inflation, budget transfers, interest rates, military procurement, and household credit can reveal strains that political messaging obscures. State bank economists are especially informative because their institutions sit close to lending conditions and government priorities. Removing a prominent analyst can discourage colleagues from publishing unwelcome forecasts, reducing the quality of information available to policymakers and markets. Information quality matters. It also deprives officials of an internal warning signal. One dismissal does not prove economic collapse, and Russia can redirect resources or suppress visible symptoms for long periods. The narrower inference is that public discussion of the war's cost has become institutionally sensitive. Al Jazeera and NBC News add context about the political environment around the personnel move, while official data remains necessary to judge scale. If analysis becomes less candid, decision-makers may misprice subsidies, credit risk, or future budget needs even when the underlying statistics remain available. The information loss is therefore part of the economic story, not merely a workplace dispute. A public denial of negotiations does not prove every diplomatic channel is closed. Reuters and AP News report the no-talks position while regional security and shipping risks remain active. Formal negotiations involve announced delegations or a structured agenda, whereas back channels can run through mediators without producing a public meeting. Leaders sometimes deny scheduled talks to preserve leverage, reassure allies, or avoid appearing to concede before conditions are met. That does not establish that secret contacts exist. It means the statement has a narrower meaning than a permanent diplomatic rupture. Sanctions decisions, military posture, and messages carried by regional governments can all communicate policy without a negotiating table. The Strait of Hormuz magnifies the consequences because insurers and freight markets price perceived disruption before cargo is actually blocked. Oil traders can react to risk premiums before diplomats acknowledge any change in posture. That ambiguity can move global energy prices before any government changes sanctions or deploys additional forces. CNBC and Al Jazeera provide market and regional context that a single White House quotation cannot supply. A mediator's public involvement, a change in sanctions enforcement, or a new military order would each signal a different direction. The useful distinction is between no announced meeting, no indirect contact, and no willingness to bargain. Those are not interchangeable claims. Working groups create a process. They do not create enforceable terms. Politico and PBS describe U.S.-Israeli coordination on disarmament, aid, and security, not a completed settlement. Such groups can organize technical questions that leaders later convert into policy, but meetings alone do not resolve who must act first. Disarmament requires definitions of prohibited weapons, a surrender mechanism, independent verification, and consequences for noncompliance. Humanitarian access raises a different chain of authority involving crossings, inspections, distribution, and protection for aid workers. Security arrangements can conflict with aid delivery if one side treats access as conditional leverage. Legitimacy also depends on who participates. Excluding Palestinian representatives, regional mediators, or international monitors can make implementation harder even if U.S. and Israeli officials agree internally. Politico and Axios emphasize diplomatic organization, while Al Jazeera and PBS add perspectives on humanitarian and regional consequences. Sequencing is the central obstacle because aid, security guarantees, governance, and disarmament may each be demanded before another party moves. Process without enforcement can merely defer conflict. Without published benchmarks, even frequent meetings can mask disagreement over who disarms, who monitors compliance, and who controls aid delivery. Measurable commitments would specify responsible parties, deadlines, verification, and what happens after a breach. Until then, the groups are a negotiating framework rather than proof of progress on the ground.